started, how do myths get started, folk tales, things like that. I'm just very fascinated by that. And how do the creatures of the natural world talk to each other, whether they're the same species talking or whether they're back and forth across big gaps, like the difference of talking to trees. So all of that is in here. And I'm going to start off with reading you the title. It's a collection of small essays, and the title, "The Bird That Swallowed the Music Box," sounds like a fable, and it sort of is, but I made it up. And so I have to tell you that it's not an old folktale or anything. It's just something I made up. When I was listening to Swainson's thrushes singing in the evening in the summer, and I was out in the woods living in a house sitting, and I had never heard so many thrushes together. They would gather in the evening around the house and sit in the trees, and they would sing. And after a while, I felt like sort of the Jane Goodall of Swainson's thrushes, and I was listening to them, and it occurred to me, and I can't verify this, I'm not an ornithologist, but it seemed like they never sang the same song twice. And my conception of birdsong before had always been that birds all sang the same thing kind of over and over like a music box, you know. And so I was listening very carefully, and the thrushes have a fairly complex song, so I can't say that they didn't eventually repeat if they went around this big loop, but it sounded to me. So anyway, this came out of that experience. Tell me, when in total silence the local forest thrushes begin to assemble and to look about themselves on early summer evenings, does this small preliminary ritual, repeated so often during their singing season, does it shape the song that then occurs around the folded feathers of them? Each bird in its territory sings by note into phrase, by phrase into measure, and by measure into the fullness of an improvised fractal composition. How do they stay sane enough to continue without knowing they are unique among birds and are precisely splitting each new outburst of melody as if it were a seed? This on each evening for the month or two during which they are moved to sing. I am a merry-go-round mannequin yanked by the pole at the top of my head and tossed off the wheel. My pole goes into the soft ground. I see the whirling stars beneath my chin. I hear that foolish bird, the ancient one, swallow the music box when a lesser god tossed it out of an airplane like a pop bottle into the jungle. It never hit the ground. The first thrush opened his beak. A whir and click, and the process was begun. A little breeze passes through the pine woods, and the Swainson's thrush flies to a closer branch. My vertical ear slowly fills again like an oil lamp, the song, the beautiful. Deep in the brown bird's throat is a music box. Yes, but it has long stopped, has flattened into silver sheets as thin as parchment, through which might be seen the shape of the machine that strangled the original bird from the inside out. Each evening, not theme and variation, only theme. Beginning again, listen. The ancient bird's voice darkened with blood and pain. For centuries it could not stop spewing clots as the music box slowly unwound, clearing its windpipe, another hollow bone. Do they now, the entire thrush tribe, on summer evenings centuries later, still split voice as if it were a seed, so a song may be permitted at the very least to reappear, as its music box version would have done? How can I, a human, remember this chained song in its entirety when it has not yet cooled, thickened, and slipped tear-shaped from the pipette throat, unless I assume it's beautiful for the wrong reason, as I've always done? So now, of the essays in here, most of them are sort of serious, And a couple of them are humorous, and I was looking earlier today, and I discovered, well, the humorous ones are actually all about birds. That one was not particularly humorous, but so I'm going to slip in another bird one, and this one is meant to be sort of funny. It's about the raven. And I don't know, there are ravens around here, not terribly common, but I spent 2 months in Taos, New Mexico once, which is absolutely infested with ravens and ravens. And they are such amazing birds. You just never know what kind of sound is going to come out of their bodies. So this one's called honking. Unlike most birds who pour into the air complete vocal masterpieces honed by evolution, raven has been chosen as the one to emit what in the final annals of the world will be listed as honk. This important slot in the index has been held open for him for a long time. Yes, raven is meant to do the honk, which he's always trying to perfect, which he's always trying out a brand new version of that never quite works. But we stop and listen every time he flies over because we can hear his lordly mind working up there, convinced that this latest set of tentative, dare I say feeble, airborne croaks is the real thing, at last, at last. And if it were, it would indeed be magnificent. Does anything then actually honk? Well, no, not yet. Raven makes many different calls, but they all sound as if he's practicing for an ultimate one that will happen differently later. Sometimes the sound he makes seems to be muffled by leather, so that he is a bird creaking overhead. The world darkens imperceptibly in disappointment. Long ago, Raven and his call seem to have been separated, so each of them wanders orphaned in the world, looking for the other. Sometimes he flies over, emitting the kind of sound that usually happens inside the oarlock of a rowboat, as if he came out of the egg in a cave where he could produce enormous resonances with very little effort. The proportions were wrong. The space itself was doing most of the work. So when he emerged into the larger world, it was as if his throat had shrunk for lack of exercise. He was a blowhard without an instrument. Like the prince who comes to the castle seeking to marry the princess but fails the king's 3 tests? No, because there is at least a princess. And because eventually one prince does succeed, although not without the assistance of magic. For Raven to find his honk, there is no magic. Humans are up against a similar bit of pesky mythical chicanery. We keep striving to do the one great thing we know we must do, but have never heard or seen an example of. And even if we had, we're not cut out to do this thing we try for, so we continue to hone our skills at accomplishing extremely difficult feats in place of it, some of them quite beside the point. An entire galaxy of activities pours out of us, but no honk. Raven reminds us that in some other universe there is honk. We have all heard it in our genes, in the star-borrowed marrow of us. Raven will carry it in muffled form throughout the ages, like hunter-gatherers used to carry the embers of their fires wrapped in moss and hide when they moved camp from place to place. When the dark bird rose through the sky above us, softly displacing the air with his wing flaps, yelping and creaking, those of us down below on the forest floor can nod a little and remember so many things we know. The color of the centaur's eye, sitting on the serpent's knee. I have to give Thomas Hardy credit for that last one, sitting on the serpent's knee. I didn't make that up. That was Thomas Hardy. I was surprised when I read that in a poem. I thought, hey, that's great. So I stole it. I'm going to read, actually now, I'm going to read an actual story, because that seems to be what the evening is people telling strange stories, or interesting stories, or sad ones. So this, trying to get there, it's It's called April Fool's Day 1996 at the Amtrak station in Atlanta, Georgia. And I was there, so I can tell you what it was like. It happened to be the year 1996 that Atlanta was hosting the Summer Olympics, and so April Fool's Day was a couple of months ahead of time, and I was visiting my parents in Clemson, South Carolina, so I flew to Atlanta and then took the train up to Clemson. So this is my adventure. I am lightheaded with fever. This means when things start going wrong, I don't even notice. I lug my overstuffed suitcase without wheels through all the temporary construction tunnels at the Atlanta airport to get down to ground level. I go outside into the frigid April breeze and stand for half an hour with all the other puzzled and shivering people in the carousel of shuttle vans, and I don't feel even a blip of irritation. Why didn't they tell me I would need a sweater in Atlanta? Why are there too many people to fit into each van? And why am I always at the end of the line? The Olympics don't even start for another 3 months. The driver snickers when I tell him I'm going to the Amtrak station. He doesn't bother to ask what time my train leaves. The other people are all going to hotels like the Hilton and the Sheraton, which is what you're supposed to be doing in an airport van. So we drive them to their hotels first, all 8 of them, one at a time. This takes about an hour and a half, during which we tour most of Atlanta. You think things are bad now, says the driver sardonically. He has a sardonic mustache. Already we're getting traffic for the Olympics, already. What if my train were leaving in 15 minutes, I muttered to myself. But who would go to a train station from an airport? The Atlanta airport probably occupies 5,000 acres and employs a bajillion taxi and van drivers and caterers and shopkeepers and airline mechanics and ticket agents and security personnel. The Amtrak station dozes shabbily in a hollow on a downtown corner with parking for about a dozen cars. It is possible to reach it by bus from the airport, but first you have to take the subway, then get off at the Arts Center and transfer to bus number 23 while lugging your ancient suitcase. The subway system is attached to the airport basement like a suckerfish onto its host, pulling people down from the sky to continue their travels beneath the earth, but not to the train station. I am deposited at the Amtrak station 2 hours early for my train. How can this be, you might well ask? Because there are only 2 trains per day, the southbound in the morning and the northbound in the afternoon. The airplane schedules exist in a different world than that of trains. I'm beginning to think my romantic notion of chugging directly into the station at Clemson, South Carolina, scarcely 2 miles from my parents' house, my mother and father waiting on the platform, may have become like an old home movie that ends with a great flashing of black and white dots and then oblivion. But then I do have a mild fever. When I walk into the train station, I notice 2 waiting rooms, one smaller than the other. I suppose this is left over from the days of segregation. A black woman with her active little boy are the only other people in the station. They are sitting in the small room, so I feel inclined to sit there too, at least for a while. The benches out there are larger, like old church pews with high backs and ample seats. The benches in here have those stupid little dividers so you can't stretch out your feet. Despite my fever, I decide I'm up for this. I pull out my notebook to work on a poem. I set my lumpy luggage in front of me like a hassock, remove my Birkenstock sandals to put on some socks against the chill, take a slug of water from my water bottle, and feel quite competent. I look up at the cobwebs on the enormous round windows at the end, the round window at the end of the room, and at the thin April light coming in through its opaque white panes. If I keep my chin up, I might almost believe I'm in a cathedral. But when my chin comes down, I see the old-timey vending machines, and I simply must go and get myself a cup of that vile coffee with the powdered milk that comes out scalding hot into a styrofoam cup. I buy some peanut butter crackers, the ones of a color between orange and yellow, a color food should not be. An hour goes by, more people come in, my head starts to ache. A pleasant young ticket office employee is circulating among the waiting crowd, letting each of us know personally that the train is an hour late. This is not a dream. I start to walk around the outer room. I keep excusing myself as I step over the extended legs of an old couple. Finally, I stop to talk to them. They tell me they are going to New York. Their luggage is discreetly scruffy. They seem accustomed to long waits. I look out through the back door along the platform to the tracks far below the station, the empty tracks. I am in a glass cage. A man in a red shirt goes out this door. Soon I see him making wide gestures with his cigarette. He is standing on the edge of an abyss. The woman doing crossword puzzles has not looked up for an hour now. A taxi driver comes in asking for a wheelchair. There's a big woman out there, a really big one, he says. They wheel her in, and she heaves herself onto the wide bench, leans back, covers her face with a cowl. Children are going through contortions on the benches. Two young men talk in Spanish across an aisle. A man and woman speak German over by the water fountain. The young ticket agent makes regular appearances. He talks briefly with the fat lady, coaxing her out from under her scarf, talks to the crossword puzzle lady, to a restless and sweaty young man seated by the cigarette machine. It's coming, he assures us all with big grin, and we think to ourselves, April Fool. Some old music is trapped above the ceiling fan, where it gabbles and hisses to itself like a bumblebee, unable to escape through a window. I try to listen to it, but its edges have run amok, as if long ago someone forgot to turn it off. One day maybe it will wear itself completely out and dry up into a fine dust, that the rain will come down from the ceiling and make the passengers, sneeze. Gone will be another tradition from the day of the train. The train is now an hour and a half late. This is not a dream. I stand at the front window looking out into the city. Across the street, a pancake house. Shall I go out for a walk? In Athens, Greece, I probably would. Maybe even in Madrid or Tokyo. But this is the Amtrak station in Atlanta, Georgia. I have a fever. This feels more like a prison than a cathedral. Through the thick city dusk in front of the station, a man jogs slowly down the sidewalk. He turns his head our way, looks at me for a second or two through the window. He will carry my eyes as seeds in himself to disperse through the world, as I will carry his. That thought occupies me for quite some time. Everybody has looked at someone who has looked at someone, clear back to Adam and Eve. Thus we are all connected. The station employees want to go home. Let's party, says one of the young Spanish-speaking men. He is sort of talking about all of us, sort of not. Is this April Fool's Day or what? Says the father of one of the energetic children. People are taking it all philosophically instead of getting angry. There's a general tendency for conversation. People are looking at one another more often, making exaggerated grimaces and shrugs. This is where the Olympics will take place in a few months. It's an election year. The time is out of joint. I am lightheaded with fever. If we stay here much longer, we'll probably all be in love. That was so weird. I think it was finally about 3 hours late. It just went on and on and on. I've got time for probably for one more. And I think I'm gonna take the chance and read this one, which some of these are more informal than others, and this one kind of borders on. Well, I won't judge it ahead of time. It's the longest essay in the book, and it's called the Physicality of Language, because I've always puzzled over that. Language is just hot air coming out of your mouth. And what's physical about it? Well, sometimes it actually is. And this is it's a 4-part essay, and I'm only going to read the first part. And then blame it on Chaucer. It's called Chaucer Stirs Things Up, and I'm going to have to read the opening 3 lines of Chaucer's the prologue of the Canterbury Tales, and in my awful, awful, awful Middle English accent, so please bear with me. One evening I sat in the audience at a poetry reading, waiting for it to start, like right here. Other people were talking quietly, but I wasn't conversing or paying attention to individual words, only aware of the general hum. Then, from directly behind me, a voice began to speak slowly in a hoarse whisper. When that April with his showers sought, the drought of March hath pierced to the road, and bathed every vein in sweet liquor. The first 3 lines from the prologue of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales were being spoken in beautiful Middle English dialect. Immediately, my body began to shake beyond my control. My eyes filled with tears. I could hardly breathe. This was a very different reaction from the one I would soon be having when I listened to 2 poets read their contemporary lines. I didn't turn around to see who was behind me. The uncanny whisper ended abruptly after these 3 lines and never resumed for the rest of the evening. But I was stunned by the simple, almost brutal physicality of my response, as if I actually had been touched by these words. After I got home, I felt a need to think about the experience. In what way can words alone become so physical? Daily, we exercise our human capacity to emit, absorb, and shape a variety of sounds with our ears, mouths, chests, stomachs. We are physically involved in regularly altering air. Words themselves are not objects, yet listening to 3 lines of Chaucer at that particular moment was for me the same as being struck in the solar plexus by a stone. It was like my entire body being rubbed inside and out with something uniquely rough and prickly. I had a physical reaction to those words that did not come from their meaning, nor from some passing resemblance to noises of predators, weapons, or the mesmerizing rhythm of drum beats. Several persistent questions refused to go away. Was this just a fluke brought about by an odd combination of circumstances? Did this happen in the past quite often? If so, where? When? Why? Why doesn't it happen more? Mine was not a secondary reaction first processed by the conscious mind. It had little or nothing to do with meaning, rhythm, meter, assonance, alliteration, rhyme. This felt much farther down the brainstem ladder toward the visceral, and yet more refined at the same time. I had been unaccountably catapulted into some kind of earlier human relationship with language, and it was neither a simple nor an unmindful one. Chaucer's words had to do with spring. Therefore, my response may have been preconditioned to be stronger than if he had been talking about a divorce or a fishing trip. Nevertheless, some combination of meaning, sound, rhythm, and the particular situation conjured for me an original emotional experience and was not simply evoked as the memory of a previous one. Speaking as a poet, I've come to recognize that raw emotions are like rare natural resources. They must be actively mined through some extraction process with tools. They do not obey ordinary verbal commands. Be happy! Or cues any more than volcanoes and hurricanes do. And like weather gods, their powers should not be fooled with. Not surprisingly, humans seem to be constructed much like Earth itself. We have a seething central core, well insulated from the surface by various levels of relatively opaque matter, our brains, for example. But there are vents through which the steam is regularly allowed to release. I believe the ritual of oral storytelling in poetry was one of those vents, and one of poetry's original functions. It is a function now basically obsolete. And yes, my brief experience with the first few words in Chaucer's amazing poem was related to spring, and through the propelling juice of this season, I came into the rhetorical space that ancient poetry used to carve out for itself whenever people gathered for important rites and ceremonies. I could feel a seething in his words. I could feel the ancient collective urgency and Ridlick fire moving through his lines. I was connecting with the enormous tradition in ancient myth and story in which words, under the right conditions, can have actual power to bring new matter into the world, rather than simply serving as a stamp of identification and approval afterwards. So the first thing I settled in my mind was that my physical reaction was not because I was remembering some event in my own past, one that the words had brutally yanked from my poor, quivering, unconscious mind. Poetry can do that too, but this was not about me. This was much older, like the language of original naming. Thanks.